Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be covering things like some population and culture and a little bit on economics for South America. And without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. All right, we've covered quite a few things, but here we're going to be, again, talking about population. And there's so much we could talk about in terms of the indigenous civilizations that lived in South America at the time, prior to contact with the Europeans. But since it's a kind of a shorter class, a little bit condensed, we're going to focus mostly on the Inca. So again, there's over thousands of different indigenous groups and different languages and all of those things throughout South America. But the Inca at the time that the European came across were at their ascendancy. So they started out about 1200 AD and they ended, if you want to call it that, in 1531, 1532. And they began as a small group near Lake Titicaca. They made their way up and they found this ideal place called Cusco, which became the capital of the Incan Empire. And from there, they started to conquer their neighbors. And as they did so, they would assimilate them into the Incan culture. And the Inca is not an actual like indigenous group, it's a collection of all these different groups. And the Inca is actually just the head Inca, the royal leader of it, and he was considered a deity. But the Incan Empire is called that. And eventually it expanded to go all the way from Ecuador through Chile, from the Pacific coast into the Amazon, a place that stretches much further across than even Europe. So it was an amazing, huge empire. And again, they assimilated groups, many different indigenous groups and different speakers into their empire. And they're very good at, for example, stonework. Their architecture is amazing. They also had a lot of amazing road building opportunities where they created roads that went stretched throughout the empire, connecting everything. They had their own kind of Pony Express, if you want to call it. It was a human relay. So they would pass messages on, and people would run along these roads, and they were able to communicate across their entire empire. And so we'll talk a bit more about them coming up. Other types, especially in the Amazon area, you had more hunter and gatherer groups, although there were settlements as well in the Amazon basin. And then you had some semi-nomadic groups in the southern part in places like Chile and Argentina. So, going to start with one of the most famous places in the Incan Empire, and that's Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is actually on the downslope into the Amazon basin. It sits at about 7,800 feet in elevation. And everyone thought this was the lost city of the Inca and it was their final fortress. But in fact, it turned out to be a summer palace for the Incan royalty. But it's a really amazing place. And if you get to go on the study abroad, we get to hike there and spend 3 days and hike up the mountain. I'm just gonna do something fun right now. If we actually take this image and we put it on its side, you can see that this mountain forms a face. So here's the eye socket, here's the nose, here's the mouth, here's the chin. Now, that was probably on accident. It's just kind of a unique little thing to when you take a look at it that you can see kind of a face on the mountain. They also did a lot of terracing. So the Andes are very steep, so you have a lot of steep land. And so they did a lot of terracing to create flat land to grow crops. And this did several things. One is that this area in the Andes is very much prone to landslides, for example, and erosion. So by creating these terraces, they actually stabilize the mountain. And then with the flat areas, they're able to grow crops. And with depending on the angle with the sun, they can kind of moderate the temperatures and grow different types. And then it's also really good for irrigation. So water can be used coming from springs uphill to water a lot of the crops. And they grew things like potatoes, corn, quinoa, amongst other things. Another thing they had were, of course, they domesticated animals. And this includes things like llamas, alpacas, and vicuñas. The vicuñas are wild, but the alpacas and llamas are domesticated. And these are actually related to camels. It's part of the camel family. So right here on the left, this is an indigenous woman with her alpaca. And the great thing about alpacas, they're a little bit shorter. They're really good to eat. I know you may not want to hear that. And they also provide some of the greatest wool in the world. So getting an alpaca sweater or beanie hat or whatever, I have a lot of them. The alpaca wool is just really, really amazing. And then here is in Cusco, and this is a lady, and then she has her llama. So alpacas were for their wool as well as for food. Llamas were for carrying things. They were basically an animal that would carry your goods. And this is a place in Cusco, a famous alley, and we'll talk about this in a bit. But basically, this city was the center of the Incan Empire, and it was amazing architecture and their stonework, where they created, amazing foundations and buildings. When the Spanish came in, they razed most of that, and then they built their buildings on top of the Incan foundations. And the reason for that partly is because it was so well done. It was earthquake proof. So this place has lots of earthquakes. And so it would swell and come back together. The foundations wouldn't buckle. But every time an earthquake hit, the Spanish buildings would fall down and they have to rebuild, but the foundations remained. Now, in terms of population and settlement, of course, we have the indigenous populations, especially in the Andes, but also, in the Amazon basin and other locales. But when Columbus came across in 1492, suddenly he thought that he'd made it to Asia. And the Portuguese at the same time, they were going the other direction. They were going around the Horn of Africa to reach Asia for the trade. So when they came across this conundrum, they met with the Pope, and the Pope did the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's a town in Spain, where he drew a line saying, the Spanish, you have access everywhere west of this line, and the Portuguese east of this line. I'm not sure what happens when they meet on the other side of the world, but that was the basic one that they did. And they didn't know what South America looked like. They hadn't been to South America at this point. So the line actually came across and cut off part of Brazil. So part of Brazil then was given authority to the Portuguese. And that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese and was a Portuguese colony, whereas the rest was Spanish. Now, for South America, the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire came from Pizarro, another conquistador. He worked underneath Cortez when they conquered the Aztec, and he used the same types of, the ways of going about it in terms of sneakery and how to conquer another empire. And so he used those same strategies. And he came down, he failed on his first trip, but on his second trip in 1532, he was able to conquer the Inca. The Inca had just gone through a civil war, and they also had disease that actually made it to the Inca. And so there was some disease things that happened that kind of spread faster than the Spanish or the Portuguese themselves. And so he came in and he was able to trick the leader, the head Inca, and they were able to capture him and hold him ransom and then disassemble the empire and take over. The demographic impact is the same as we saw in the Caribbean and Middle America. 90 to 95% of all indigenous populations had died within 150 years. And you can see down there the numbers between Ecuador and Peru about how decimating this was for their populations in a very short time period within like 100, 150 years. And then they did turn to African slaves, not so much, a little bit in places like Colombia, in Peru, but for the most part, we saw most of those slaves being imported going to Brazil. We've seen this before about the amounts of slaves that were brought to the Americas, and you can see in Brazil, over 3.7 million slaves were brought into Brazil. And that was mostly for the sugarcane plantations. Now, other settlement groups, we did have Europeans that came, of course, the Spanish and Portuguese. But then later, we saw large numbers, and this was kind of a big era of migration of Europeans to other parts of the world. Europe was going through the demographic transition. Their populations were exploding. People were going to urban areas, and as they industrialized, they had an excess of population. So we see a lot of Europeans migrating, especially to the United States, but also Canada. But there's also a sizable amount that went to South America. And especially in the 1870s and 1930s, a lot of Italians and Germans settled in southern South America. So the southern part of Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. At the same time that they were also coming to the US, but this was another outlet for that excess population. We also, similar that we saw in North America, we saw migration of people from Asia, especially people from Japan and China. So just as California received a lot of migrants from Japan and China during this time period, they also went to South America, especially after in 1880s, the U.S. passed the Oriental Exclusion Act, in limiting or actually getting rid of any migration from China and Japan to the United States. And as the Californians, you guys probably know that history pretty well. But then they moved towards South America. So, for example, in Brazil, the city of Sao Paulo has the largest amount of people of Japanese descent of any place outside of Japan. And then Peru also received a lot of migrants, especially from Japan, but the Chinese also came over as well to all these countries. Just one example of that in Peru in the 1990s, their president was Fujimori, who was from Japan. Well, his parents were from Japan. Now, taking a look at the population geography for South America, we can see some areas that we have clusters. And one thing to note is that 75% urban. So the majority of people actually live in urban areas. The clusters, we have clusters along the coastal region, especially when we think about Brazil, and then coming down to Uruguay and Argentina. And then in the highlands, and that's always been the case. So the Andes have always had higher population densities. But overall, it's a very relatively low density. I mean, compare this to East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Africa, Europe, etc. You can see that there are some clusters, but a lot of it is very, relatively low population densities across it, especially because of the Amazon basin. It's not as conducive to settlement in the Amazon for multiple reasons, the soils, disease, the temperatures, etc. And then the southern cone, we see also lower population densities. So this is one of the areas that doesn't have a huge issue in terms of being highly densely populated, like we see in Egypt or in India or China. Now, in terms of migration, as we've seen in the other regions, rural to urban, although they're kind of reaching sort of an equilibrium where you can't get a whole lot more urban than being 75 to 80% urban. Now, within the region, we see a lot of migration going into the Amazon, and we discussed that in a previous class. So in Brazil, they had their settlement projects, and that's still occurring. So there's land, opportunities, gold, other types of things. So there's a lot of migration into the frontier from Brazil, but we also see it in the Andes, coming from the highlands of Peru into the Amazon basin. And we saw that in our video. Happens in Ecuador and Bolivia, and Colombia. Sorry, I doubled up on that. We also have some migration that comes to the United States. It's relatively less than we see from Middle America or the Caribbean because of distance decay, right? It's not as geographically proximate, but we do have migration that comes to the United States. But you see a much more prominent ones going to places like Europe and Japan. So being in Spain, we noticed that a lot of people there were actually had come from Ecuador, as well as Colombia. And then you see in the southern cone, a lot of people are going to places like Italy and Spain, as well as Portugal from the Brazilian side. The Japanese migration is a little bit more interesting, and that's because if we've talked about this before, Japan is in stage 5 of the demographic transition. They're not replacing their population. Their population is actually in decline. So to make up for that, to have your workforce and people that can pay into Social Security and take care of those dependents that are the elderly, they're looking for migrants. But being Japan, it's a very relatively homogeneous society, meaning most people are Japanese. They don't have a whole lot of other groups of people or diversity that's in Japan. There's some exceptions. So they're turning to the descendants of those migrants that left Japan to go to South America and looking at some of them and recruiting them to come in to form part of their workforce and the more younger generation. Now, in terms of urban settlement patterns, you can see that we have some really large cities, and a lot of this is urban primacy, meaning that you have one major city, usually the capital, but not always, but usually. And that's where the focus of, political, economic, all of those things are and the services are focused on those kind of large cities. So we see Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is at 20 million people, Rio de Janeiro, 13, Buenos Aires, about 13 million. And then, as you see here, over 40 cities with over 1 million people. So in many of these countries, there's really a focus on the capital city. In Chile, it's in Santiago. In Peru, it's Lima. If you go up to, Quito, Ecuador, or Bogota, Colombia, these are kind of the focus. And so that's where migrants go to. That's where a lot of the services are provided. But you can see that it's a highly urbanized region. Now, the urban model, I'm going to just highlight a couple of things because it gets a little bit complex. But basically, the law of the West Indies, when Spain was coming over, they laid out a grid pattern. You had a central plaza, then you had government and religious things on the plaza, and then outwards you had the shops, and it was a grid pattern. As you went further away from the center, they created the barrios, and these were for indigenous populations. And then that grid pattern broke down and became much more organic and mixed up. Today, the cities have grown exponentially, and you have a central business district with your high rises and your businesses and a market, and that's where the central plaza usually is. Then as you move outward from that central business district, you have these areas, the zone of maturity. These are old buildings, but they're very historic and very beautiful. And so you tend to have shops and kind of some, relatively middle to upper class populations. There are areas of disamenity. These are places that have broken down, so you have poor people that fill into those areas, but not as much. The elite then tend to go from the central business district on like a broad avenue, a really big, nice, really avenue that comes out that has all the high-end shops, your Tiffany's, Saks Fifth Avenue and stuff, because you do have some very rich people, but it's a small amount of the population. And then they live along that spine, the elite spine. The middle class tends to cluster next to it. And then the poor, and of course, the industry is on the other side of the city because rich people don't like to see industry next to them. And then the poor populations that are coming from the rural areas into the urban areas, they come into the periphery, the outskirts of the city. And it's usually hilly terrain, mountainous, things that most people don't want to build on, but it's the only land that's available to them. So when they come in, they squat on it. They call it squatter settlements or shanty towns because they don't have title to the land, but they do plan it out. And they build their housing with whatever materials are available. Could be aluminum siding, wood pallets, bamboo, whatever they can get their hands on. And on the right, we can see examples of this, the famous favelas in Rio de Janeiro up here in the middle. And then the bottom one shows one of the famous favelas, which again is a shanty town or a squatter settlement. And then you can see right next to it, you can see the downtown area where the wealthy are living. So they're just finding any kind of land, and it's a chance to be marginal that they can build on. Of course, they're more susceptible to things like flooding and landslides. And if there's earthquakes, if they're in that area, this materials won't stand up to it. Now, generally, we call it like shanty towns, squatter settlements. I personally like to call it self-help housing. That sounds maybe kind of bad, but the idea is that people come in and over time, as they earn some more wealth, get better jobs, become a bit more upward mobilely, they then can start building cinder block ones. And eventually it can create these things over 30, 40, 50 years. These squatter settlements can turn into, just kind of lower income housing that is much more stable. And we've seen that in places like Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Lima, Peru, etc. So again, the key thing is that you have the poor people living actually on the edges of town, as opposed to what we often think about in the United States, where we have the inner city. So let's move on to culture. So we're going to talk about ethnicity and social race. These are always controversial topics. Here in the United States, we have our own issues with race, of course. In Latin America, there's a lot more of mixed populations. We've talked about mestizos in Middle America, the mix of indigenous people with, people of European descent. And so in this case, it's considered a social race. All race is social. It's something that we've created socially. There's no real reason that we should divide the world up or people up into different groups based just on how they look. It's just that we socially do it. There's the genetic diversity, it doesn't matter. So I'm kind of going into the weeds there. But so that's what we call social race, that we've just created as a society, that we do treat people differently on how they look. In Latin America, it's related to that, but it's much more about lifestyle. So indigenous populations, where they wear traditional dress, they speak their local language, they might follow some of their kind of more local religious beliefs, they often are farmers, they're considered the lower classes. The mestizo group, which is mixed, tends to be more the middle class. And then people of European descent and livelihood tend to be considered the higher classes. And there's also an altitudinal thing to this, especially in the Andes, where along the coastline you have much more of the high class, the European kind of ones, and it's wealthier. And then as you move up into the highlands, it becomes more mixed. And when you get into the really highlands, it becomes much more indigenous. Now, the way that you can change your social race is your livelihood. So if you're an indigenous person and you speak Quechua and you do traditional dress, etc., if you move to the city, you change your dress of what you're wearing, you change your job and start working in a business or a factory or whatever it is. You speak more Spanish, go to the church, you suddenly move your social race up to being kind of in the middle class. And then if you start wearing suits and get a job as a banker or a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, you can actually move up into the higher classes. So it is more movable than we see here in the United States, just based on lifestyle and your choice. Now, the largest indigenous populations are in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And Bolivia is one country just like Guatemala, where the majority of people are actually of indigenous descent. And on the right, we see an Aymara woman in her traditional dress, which was actually imposed by the Spanish, but it's considered traditional today. And that's with the guy next to her is Evo Morales. He's no longer in power, but he became in the early 2000s the first indigenous president of Bolivia, even though it's a majority indigenous population. He was a former coca farmer, and we'll talk about coca later on with drugs. It's a legal thing there. And he became president. He was the first indigenous president in Bolivia's history. So that also relates to language. Obviously, we have Spanish and Portuguese as official languages for Brazil and the other countries. But there are lots and lots of other indigenous populations and indigenous languages. Quechua is one of the largest ones in the Andes, but there's Aymara, there's all these other different ones that you can see that still exist. And if you go up into the highlands and some of those indigenous communities, many times the older population, they don't even speak Spanish. They only speak their indigenous language, maybe a little bit of Spanish. The younger population is learning more Spanish, but also English as well. We did have a bit of a problem working with the communities on the stove burning project in that, it was hard. You couldn't communicate in many ways with them because they didn't speak Spanish or a little bit, but we actually had translators that spoke Quechua to allow us to be able to communicate with those populations. Now, religion is going to be very similar to what we saw in Middle America. The Spanish and Portuguese obviously brought Catholicism, but there was thousands of different local religious beliefs at the time. And that created those syncretic religions, the mixing of beliefs. And that includes with indigenous ones in the Andes and in the Amazon basin, and then with especially in Brazil, which they brought so many slaves over from Africa, they brought their own religions just as we saw in the Caribbean. And so those blended, the African animistic religions blended with Catholicism into things like Candomblé in Brazil, amongst many others. So here's a couple of examples, just like we saw in Middle America. In Cusco, Peru, which was the capital of the Incan Empire, all roads led to Cusco. And they had a temple of the sun. And it was basically a temple that was encased in gold. And that was kind of the center of the Incan world. So the Spanish came in, they stripped all the gold away, destroyed much of the buildings, and then they built a church on top of it, the Church of Santo Domingo, which is a monastery and a Catholic church, right on top of it. But if you look at the bottom, that kind of gray area in the middle, that's the Incan foundations of the Temple of the Sun. So again, they built right on top of those foundations. Here's another view of it from the side, and you can see those black stones and just how intricate that is. They didn't have any kind of cement or mortar. They basically just designed them so that they fit together perfectly. You can't even put a piece of paper in between the stones. They're just stuck together. And when an earthquake hits, it expands. And then when it's done, it comes back together. And so it's earthquake proof. But if you look on the left-hand side, that's the Spanish building. And so an earthquake hits, that all collapses. And they have to rebuild on top of the Incan foundations. Now, 1960s, there was an earthquake that hit and destroyed much of this cathedral. But inside, it opened up all of the old original Incan ruins of the Temple of the Sun. And so today, this is both an active cathedral, it's also a monastery, and it's also a museum. In the middle part, they didn't replace all that. They actually just made it look like it was during the Incan era. Same thing with Christ figures. This is the pretty much the most famous Christ figure in Cusco, and it's called El Señor de los Temblores, which is the Christ of the earthquakes. Now, originally, and also as you can see, it's similar to the Black Christ of Esquipulas in that it has a darker complexion to it. And early on, it was the Christ of solitary and of kind of solitude. But in the 1600s, a huge earthquake hit, destroyed much of the city, and the people were scared. They ran in and they grabbed the first Christ figure they could find and took it out in procession, and the earthquake stopped. So this one became the Christ of the earthquakes, that he protects the city from earthquakes. And every year they take him out in procession around town, and it's the most revered Christ figure in Cusco. And one final one from Cusco in their main cathedral. This is the Last Supper. The Cusco School of Art basically created things where they blended the European tradition, mostly religious art, with local traditions. And the idea was they're trying to educate and convert the local populations into Christianity. And the best way is to use things that the local population is familiar with. So here's the Last Supper with Jesus Christ and his disciples. And what are they serving? We have chicha, which is a fermented corn drink that they use up in the Andes as well as in other places. We have quinoa, we have potatoes. None of that was at the Last Supper. And right in the middle, that's a guinea pig. They eat guinea pigs in the Andes. They were domesticated there as a source of protein. And so they're eating a guinea pig. They call it cuy. Another interesting thing about this picture is down on the bottom right, we see a guy looking at us, this little darker complexion. That's Judas, the one that turned over Christ to the Romans for a bag of silver, 40 coins or whatever it is. So here he is with his bag of coins and looking the other way, and that's Pizarro. So they made Judas and Pizarro into Judas, the betrayal of the kingdom. Now, another thing that's interesting in religion in Latin America is what's called liberation theology. Traditionally, the Roman Catholic Church was sided mostly, and especially with the elite populations in the urban areas. And they were with the conservative elite, and they were very political in many ways, and didn't do a whole lot to maybe help out the poor masses during those time periods, during the colonial and early independence eras. So liberation theology was brought up by some rural priests in Latin America, and they decided to mix Catholicism with Marxism. That might sound odd because many people think of Marx's quote about that religion is the opiate of the masses. And what he was actually talking about, if you read more into that passage by Marx, was that he was saying that religion was being used like an opiate. An opiate is a painkiller, right? So if I break my leg, I can take an opiate, and that's what they give people when they're hurt. It did nothing to fix my leg, but it made me feel better about having a broken leg. And they were saying that's what religion was being used as a way for the elite to make poor people feel better about their condition. It didn't change their condition. It didn't improve their condition, but it made them feel better about being in that condition. And that you'll be rewarded in the afterlife when you go to heaven or something like that. And so these rural priests said, no, religion should actually be something that actually changes their condition. Don't make them just feel good about being a good poor person. How about we find a way to give them access to education and healthcare and jobs and land and all of those things? So it became kind of a revolutionary type of an idea, but it changed around that role. And the formal Catholic Church didn't like it. A lot of priests were excommunicated, but it became a very powerful movement in the rural areas, and especially for people that were fighting for their rights and trying to change their condition. Hopefully that makes sense. And kind of look it up if you like to. The new Pope, Pope Francis, he's from Argentina. And if you see what he does in his writings, it sounds like he's a liberation theologist. He denies it, but his practices say something different, I think. Here's a famous quote by Archbishop Camara. When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And this was an area where there's a lot of uprisings throughout Latin America. We'll talk about the political geography here in a moment, of people in the countryside wanting land redistribution. Because remember, we have the latifundio and the minifundio. And so most of the people have small amounts of land and they were asking for land and redistribute that. And that is kind of a communist or Marxist viewpoint. Which means we go straight to politics, which relates to this. So let's just do one. I'm not going to do every country. So I'm just going to do Brazil. The first half of the 1900s, I mean, became independent in the 1820s, had a pretty peaceful independence from Portugal. But the first half of the 1900s, we had dictators. One of them went crazy, and so the military took over in 1964. And this, again, as I mentioned, was a time where there were uprisings in the countryside throughout Latin America. We just had the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro, and there were revolutions that were going on in other places all across Latin America and based on inequalities. So the easiest way to quell these rebellions that were often Marxist in nature was to have a military take control or a dictator and squash them. So they started hunting down subversives. Those are people that were rising up and asking for reform, and they killed over 35,000 people. The same thing happened in Argentina as well as in Uruguay during the same time period. And a lot of this was supported by the US government because we wanted to stop any insurrections before they got out of control. And we did not want communism in our backyard. It wasn't until the 1980s that they transitioned back to democracy and created a new constitution. And since then, they've actually had some relatively peaceful transitions of power. In 2002, they elected some more socialist or leftist leaders. And Da Silva was one of those. And he kind of led this time period through Brazil where they were able to really advance quite a bit progressively in terms of education and healthcare and their economy. But then he got thrown in jail for corruption. It's a common theme. And in 2019, they elected a right-wing guy named Bolsonaro. And I don't want to go political, but this is the time frame that we elected Donald Trump, and they called Bolsonaro the Donald Trump of South America. And so he had very similar policies and viewpoints. Now, Da Silva, who had been thrown in prison for corruption, that was overturned by their Supreme Court. He was let out. And in 2022, he was elected their president again. And again, a little bit more left wing, a much more progressive of figure. And we see kind of similar things throughout much of Latin America. There's a lot of corruption that does go on in the political sphere. Peru, they've had, I think, 5 or 6 presidents that have all been thrown in jail for corruption. And they actually created their own jail for those ex-presidents. But current geopolitical trends is that they almost all have democratically elected governments. I would question Venezuela on that. But then many of those that are being elected are more on the socialist left, but still considered democratic. So that is an important change. And here's a couple interesting pictures. This is the presidents of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile 35 years ago, military commanders. And here's in 2015, the same presidents. In many of these countries, their legislatures have a lot more female participation than we see in the United States. And we have yet to elect a female president. But in many of these countries, they have. And so we see kind of something different going on in Latin America in those trends. So we're going to finish up with a little bit about economic and social development. So just like we talked with Middle America, as well as the Caribbean, we had the mercantile system. So during the colonial era, the colonies existed to enrich the mother country, the colonial power. So gold and silver were huge amounts of things that were taken out of South America as well as Middle America and went back into Europe. And would go into places like Spain and Portugal, but eventually, as they spent money on religious wars and building lavish castles, it ended up in England, Germany, and the Netherlands in the banking system. Same thing with profits from the slave trade. Those all went back in, and that funneled the rise of industrial revolution and capitalism. And I'll give you an example. So again, mercantilism is accumulating bullion, having a positive balance of trade, and then just, spending on whatever you want to. Once you put it into productive, you invest it, it then becomes capitalism. So a good example is James Watt. He was a Scottish person in England, and he was an inventor. And the people that invested and gave him money for his inventions were slave traders. And one of the things that he invented was, well, improved upon, was the steam engine. And that allowed the rise of the railroad industry, textile factories, all different types of things of industrial production. And that was directly related to the profits from the slave trade being invested in the Industrial Revolution. Another one is Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank is a British-based bank. It's throughout their Commonwealth, throughout the old British Empire. They started out investing in slave ships. And then when the slave trade ended, they were in a powerful position. They'd gotten a lot of wealth, and they just turned into being a normal bank. So that led to the rise of finance, for example. And then another one is Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London is an insurance company, one of the world's largest insurance companies. They got their beginnings insuring in slave ships. And then when the slave trade ended, again, they were now the most powerful insurance company in the world because of all the profits that they had invested, gotten from the slave trade. And then they just became a normal insurance company. So there you can see how things from the colonial era, whether it's gold and silver, profits from the sugarcane trade or the slave trade, and then we are not going to talk about it now, but later, the opium trade, all got funneled into Europe, and that really helped fuel the rise of industrial production, finance, and all of those things that created capitalism. Now, because of all that and those relationships that historically have been there, they talk about this idea of post-colonial dependency, meaning that these countries were never able to develop on their own early on. And so there always have been dependent on, first of all, Europe and then later North America. So moving on to some more agricultural things, we can talk about coffee. I talked with a student, well, not today, because you guys are going to watch this later, but we think that she might be doing her globalization thing on Starbucks and coffee, and so this might be of interest. So coffee is a plant that comes from Africa, from Ethiopia. The story goes that a goat herder was up in the mountains of Ethiopia, and he noticed that his goats would come out of these bushes up in the highlands, and they'd be jumping around and all crazy. So he went up and checked it out, and they were eating berries off of this tree, and he tried it, and that was a coffee tree. It then spread very quickly through the Islamic world, as most Muslims don't drink alcohol, but coffee was okay. And so coffee shops rose up. And then it spread into Europe, and Europe really liked it, but they couldn't grow coffee. It has to grow in a certain latitude and elevation range where you can grow coffee and have it work. So they got excited, and they had to find places to grow coffee. And well, the Americas was a great place. So Brazil and Central America and Colombia in the early 1800s. The first coffee came to the Caribbean in the 1600s, but it then moved to places like Brazil and Central America. And I mentioned Colombia because it's very famous. So in Brazil, it's the largest producer of coffee in the world. And they have these huge sun-grown coffee plantations. And that produces a lower quality coffee, partly because it's grown in the sun, and coffee likes to be in the shade. It likes to have shade trees around it. So growing it in the sun, you can have a massive plantation and mass produce it. And then you can have these machines that go through and shake them and drop all the coffee beans in. But the problem is it gets bad beans and good beans. So this is what you see when you buy a Maxwell House or Folgers or kind of the really cheap coffee that you see. They do have good coffee as well, but the vast majority is this lower quality. In Central America and Colombia, as well as in the Caribbean, they produce the shade-grown coffee, and they're smaller farms. This produces a higher quality coffee, and also it's hand-picked. So they only pick the good, they call them cherries, but it's basically the coffee beans, and we won't go into that, but they only pick the good red ones. So it's a much higher quality, and that's where you get the stuff that you get at Starbucks, for example, where it's $10, $12 a pound if you want to buy coffee. In Jamaica, for example, they mentioned it before, the Blue Mountain coffee goes for $80 to $100 a pound. Now, traditional export products, again, a lot of it is for export, includes, of course, coffee, bananas. Many of our bananas come from places like Ecuador and Peru and Colombia, as well as Middle America. Sugar, Brazil is a major producer of sugarcane, always has been, as well as cattle. And cattle is very popular in southern Brazil, as well as going down into Argentina and Uruguay. But modern additions, including growing things like grapes in both Chile as well as in Argentina. They're major wine producers now. They produce some of the best wines in the world in Chile and Argentina. And then also fruits and vegetables that they can send to other parts of the world, especially because their seasons are opposite of ours. So when we're not growing some of those things, they can grow them. And we just exchange them and have them shipped back and forth. Brazil, as well as Bolivia, are major producers of soybeans. That's encroaching into the southern sections of the Amazon, as we mentioned previously. But Brazil, I believe, is the largest exporter of soybeans in the world. Flowers in Colombia. Up in the mountains of Colombia, they have this ideal climate. They're close to the equator. The temperatures and rainfall doesn't really vary that much. And so they can grow flowers year round. So on Valentine's Day, and if you're going to give flowers to somebody, um, it's a good chance that they're coming from Colombia. So the roses and everything else. So it's a major producer of flowers, which is very interesting. And then, of course, we have drugs. And by drugs, I'm specifically thinking about cocaine. So cocaine comes from the plant coca. We mentioned this before. Coca has been grown for thousands of years as a traditional plant. It's legal in places like, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. And it's been used as a mild stimulant. So you can make coca tea, or they can also make it like a chewing tobacco type thing where you actually wad it up and you put it with a type of clay and the alkaloids in there release whatever it is in the coca, and then you put it in and you chew it, and it suppresses hunger, helps with altitude sickness, stomach problems, all types of things. The traditional medicine. And if you go to a market in any of those places, you can walk in and buy a bag of coca leaves. And when you go to a hotel, the first thing they give you is coca tea. Now, the problem is that it can then be converted through a chemical process into cocaine, which is not legal. And that's the thing that the governments are trying to manage by saying, here's how much coca should be produced. And they try to manage that, but they could really never keep up with it. A lot of it gets filtered. So it's grown in places like, here's the drug trade. I'm going to come back to that. It's grown in places like the highlands of Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Bolivia. But it's processed into drugs generally in Colombia, into cocaine. And then those cartels are the ones that ship it to places like the US, as well as Europe and other parts of the world. And if you look here, this is a map that shows the drug trade. So again, coca, cannabis, opium. We're going to focus on coca at this moment. And you can see that it's produced, especially in Colombia, and then it's brought up by the different cartels through the Caribbean into Miami, or up through Central America and Middle America into the rest of the US. And then, of course, it's also exported to Europe, often trans migration through like Nigeria, and then back up to Europe. I don't think I mentioned this before, but I did work in the Corn Islands in Nicaragua on the Caribbean coast. And these islands are much more Caribbean based. And I was there doing research on tourism. But I was talking to some people and they said, I was like, what's the major industries? I said, well, it's tourism, lobster fishing, and drug shipping. I was like, what? I was like, yeah, drugs come right through here. They bring the cigar boats, they're coming from Colombia, and they come up the coast. And we're kind of a transshipment point going to the US. And I found it kind of interesting that they said, yeah, and we're always looking for the white lobster. And I was like, what does that mean? And they say, well, we can listen to the radio channels when the police or the Coast Guard are out chasing these drug running boats. And when they get chased, they throw over bales of cocaine into the water as they're trying to escape. So all the fishermen will then get in their boats, go out, and they try to find those bales of cocaine. And if they do, and that's the white lobster, because they're lobster fishermen. And when they bring it back the next year, they have a nice new boat, new house, they sold it on the black market. And that's actually and that's one of the issues that you have in middle America is not so much about drug use, it's about the transshipment of drugs and then the issues that that creates. And especially like in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala right now, the drug trade is something that's led to a lot of violence. But it's all fueled by the demand for these drugs in places like Europe and North America. Now, in terms of industrial production, Brazil dominates. Brazil produces things like steel, iron ore, cars, all types of things that they produce. And so Brazil is the dominant industrial center for South America. And frankly, it's a powerhouse in the world. We've already talked about Mexico, does have a lot, especially the maquiladoras. And then you can see Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, and Colombia have pretty decent amounts of industrial development, but it's really limited because Brazil just dominates in all this industrial production. And it's mostly for export, really not for the local markets. So today, in terms of their economic conditions, it's very much middle income countries. On this graph, I know it's from 2012, but it's relatively similar. We can see that Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile have a kind of a higher standing. They're considered upper middle income. The Andean countries are considered lower middle income. So the Andes are a bit poorer than you see from the other ones like Brazil and the Southern Cone. And by Southern Cone, I'm talking about Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Southern Brazil. But one thing that hides, so that looks at those numbers look good, is inequalities. And the Gini coefficient is one way of measuring how inequitable the distribution of income is in a country. And it takes the amount of wealth owned by the top 10% and related to the amount of wealth owned by the bottom 10% of the population. So on this one, if it's purple, you have high inequality. And you can see throughout Latin America, Middle America, and South America, and Argentina doesn't have data for some reason, we see high inequalities on par with parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And as a whole, this region is considered the most inequitable place in the world in terms of income distribution as well as land distribution. Medium is the greens. So we see a few Andean countries and the Central American ones, and the United States. I'm sure you guys acknowledge that we do have inequity in the US and it's on the rise. And then Europe and Canada, they tend to have lower inequality as well as like Japan. So when you look at the numbers in terms of their income, you say, hey, this looks really good. But then you have to understand that much of it is held by the top 10%, the richest part of the country, and the bottom section doesn't get as much. And then finally, for the Human Development Index, which doesn't take that into account, although we have some ones that do, you can see that these are all considered, most of them are considered high on the Human Development Index. Not very high like the US and much of Europe, Australia, and Japan, but they're in that kind of middle range. And there are a few that are medium, but we don't have any that are considered low like we see in sub-Saharan Africa and a few other places. So really kind of in the middle on that in terms of education, healthcare, as well as incomes, except for noting the high inequalities. Okay, we're going to stop sharing at this point. One thing I did want to talk about, because this is the last lecture before our first exam. I do have an exam one review sheet up on Canvas. Sorry, we don't use PolyLearn anymore. So you guys should have access to that. And for the essay questions, the questions are going to come pretty much from that. If you can answer all the questions and topics that I have on the review sheet, you should do well. In terms of the multiple choice sections, we're going to be bringing a lot of the ones from your reading quizzes. And that's where I want to focus your reading on. I want you to read all of those chapters and then use the reading quizzes. And then once those are closed, you'll have access to them to study from. And I'll take them directly and put them on the exam. The majority of the multiple choice, though, will come from lecture. So that's where you want to really focus your note taking. And again, you can go back and revisit these lectures as much as you want. And that's where a lot of the material will come from. Map identification, I have a list of all the countries, as well as the physical features I want you to be responsible for. And on the review sheet, I do have the practice maps, the same maps I'm going to be using on the exam. So make sure that you do that. If you guys want to get together on the Flip or Canvas discussion or whatever to have study groups, I know a lot of you are liberal studies students, so you guys should really, kind of work together if you want to do some study groups. But the map identification is basically, for example, I'll have a map up and I'll label all the countries with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's no word bank. So then you're going to have to, on the side, write in the name of that country. And then for the physical regions, I think physical things like the Andes Mountains or the Amazon River or whatever it is, I will basically draw them in like it looks like a mountain chain. I'll just make a bunch of triangles down the Andes, for example. And then I'll say, what mountain range is this? And then you have to write in the Andes. I'm giving away one of the questions. So, but that's how that's going to go. So there's no word bank, but you'll have to, take a look. You do have it on the review sheet. So I guess you could probably use that when you're taking the exam online. I'm giving you too many hints. Anyway, and let's hope that it works well. I'm going to open it up on Friday, the week before it's due, and it's due the following Wednesday. So you have the weekend and a couple of days to take the exam. It'll be timed, hour and 50 minutes, like a normal exam here at Cal Poly. And so once you start it, you have to finish it. But then you do have a pretty good amount of time. And you can take it any time during that time period. All right, that's it for this first half of the course. We've kind of covered a lot of material, and I'm excited we get moving to the second half of the course. All right, take care. And if you guys are interested in that study abroad in Peru, just let me know.